Okay, learning, chapter 6. You'll probably get 2 sections to this lecture. I'm actually in my office at the clinic, and I have an hour or so today, so I'll start the lecture here in my office, and then at some point you'll see this background suddenly change, and probably my clothing will change because it'll probably be this weekend that I finish up the lecture at home. I'm hoping that this will be the last electronic lecture until after Thanksgiving, if all goes well. But we'll keep our fingers crossed and we'll see. All right, as should be familiar to you, at this point, the first thing we'll do is we'll operationally define our terms. When we talk about learning, what we're talking about is any relatively stable change in an organism's behavior or knowledge that is due to experience. You already know the definition of learning. You may not have been able to articulate it, but you have a basic idea of what we're talking about. Conditioning is essentially the term we use for a couple of different kinds of learning. We're going to talk about classical conditioning and operant conditioning, which are learning, but they're kind of subheadings. And then we're also going to talk about something called observational learning toward the end of the lecture today. So conditioning, which again is learning, but what we're talking about here is learning of connections, or what we more technically call associations between events that occur in an organism's environment. So conditioning is learning. It's just kind of a narrower subset of types of learning. Okay, so the first kind of conditioning that we're going to talk about is what we call classical conditioning. And it's also called Pavlovian conditioning, named after the person who identified it, a Russian physiologist who was studying digestion in dogs, if I remember correctly. Classical conditioning, by definition, a stimulus requires a capacity to evoke a response that was originally evoked by another stimulus. In other words, it's learning it's learning a connection or an association between 2 stimuli. And if that doesn't make any sense to you, I'll use the example of Pavlov and his dogs. So basically what the deal was that he was, like I said, he was looking at, if I remember right, he was looking at digestion. But if you can picture a laboratory and you've got all these dogs and they're in harnesses and they're hooked up to various things to measure their physiology connected to the digestive process, including a tube in the side of the mouth to detect the amount of and the timing of salivation. And as we talked about earlier in the semester, part of the whole point of an experiment is to control for every possible variable, exclude as many extraneous variables as you can, so that hopefully you can not only identify correlation but causation. So he controlled everything as much as possible in his laboratory, was measuring all of these aspects of the digestive process, and had automated many things, including the process of feeding the animals. And I don't know the exact details. I'm sure you can find them out, but I imagine it like this. Dogs in rows, in harnesses, all the stuff attached to them, trough in front of them. They're going to study the digestive process, so they're going to present the food to the dogs, and they do so by an automated process. Somebody presses a button, there's a click, the chute opens, and the food falls into the trough, and the dogs begin to eat. And what he noticed was, well, the obvious thing that everybody knows, which is that dogs salivate in response to food. This is a reflex. You don't have to teach the dogs to do this. They don't have to learn to do this. This is something that their body does, their bodies do automatically, right? But what he noticed over time was in the interim between the click of the chute and the food actually being presented, he was finding that the dogs were actually salivating prior to the presentation of the food. So the dogs are salivating to something, in this case, the sound, the click, that was previously what we would call a neutral stimulus. The sound of a click doesn't typically make a dog salivate. But if you pair that click with the presentation of food shortly thereafter, anybody in this class knows you're going to teach that dog to salivate to that stimulus, that environmental event that is the sound of a click, right? That's classical conditioning. That's all it is. What you're doing in this case is you're teaching an association between food and the click, or in the traditional way we talked about the Pavlov's dog thing is that he would ring, he sees this pattern and goes, huh, this is interesting, and he starts playing with it, and he starts ringing a bell and then waiting a little bit and presenting the food, and pretty quickly he can get the dogs to salivate to the bell. And you could use a buzzer, or you could use a little ring 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 kind of a bell. You can do all sorts of different things. You can pair the food with almost anything and cause the dog to begin to salivate to the buzzer, to the bell, to whatever, to a light. Anything you pair with the food, if you pair it close enough in time, is going to cause this reaction in a dog. Again, this is not a surprise to you, I'm assuming. Everybody kind of knows this about animals. But what he did, what Pavlov did, and what the behaviorists, the learning people did, with this is they quantified it. They looked at it very closely, and they, you'll be glad to know, created vocabulary words that we use to describe this whole process. So let's talk in terms of those vocabulary words, because you got to know them. That's just part of this process. So we talk in terms of stimulus and response, stimuli and responses. We talk about an unconditioned stimulus. We abbreviate this US. And this is the thing that evokes a response without previous conditioning. So in our example of Pavlov's dogs, it's the food. Again, don't have to be taught to salivate to food. Your body does that automatically. It is a reflex. And so the food is the unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned response, the response that you do not have to learn, which again is generally a reflex when you're talking classical conditioning, in this case is the salivation. So unconditioned stimulus, food, unconditioned response, the UR, salivation. We also then have the terms conditioned stimulus and conditioned response, CS and CR. The conditioned stimulus is a previously neutral stimulus that acquires the capacity to evoke a conditioned response. So in this case, the conditioned stimulus, the previously neutral stimulus, was the sound of the bell or the click or the light or whatever you pair with the food in close enough temporal proximity, close enough in time, that you teach the dog that in this case that the bell means food is coming, and so the bell rings and the dog anticipates the food, gets the salivation, and you can eventually get to the point where you can ring the bell and the dog will begin to salivate whether or not the food comes shortly thereafter or not. All right, so the conditioned stimulus, which was previously neutral, is the sound, the bell, the click, whatever. The conditioned response, this is the only part that may be a little confusing for some people. The conditioned response is that, in this case, the salivation that is now not just to the food, because that was unconditioned, you didn't need to teach the dog that. You've now conditioned it. You've created an association or a connection between salivation and the sound, the bell, the click, whatever. So the conditioned response is the salivation to the previously neutral stimulus, which becomes conditioned, which the sound, the bell, right? Okay, so we've talked about classical conditioning primarily to this point in terms of Pavlov's dogs. It's the place where the context in which the classical conditioning was first identified. It's the example we typically use to introduce it. There are a couple other, or there's at least one other fairly famous example of early work with classical conditioning, and that was done by John Watson, the famous American behaviorist. And what he did is he taught a young child, a toddler named Albert, to be afraid of a little white rat. And the way he did this was he took the white rat, he put little Albert on the floor in the room and introduced the little white rat to Albert, who did not show any fear response because it's just a cute little white rat. In fact, Albert was interested in it. But then what Watson did was he repeatedly would present the rat to Albert, and when he presented the rat to Albert, he would I can't remember whether it was a bell or a buzzer, or it was some loud noise. He would make a buzzer, let's say. He would present the rat and set off this buzzer, startling little Albert. And he did this repeatedly until eventually Albert would see the rat and have the fear response that was originally caused by the buzzer, right? So the little white rat, which had been a neutral stimulus, became the conditioned stimulus as a result of being paired with, associated with the loud, scary buzzer. And in doing this, what Watson demonstrated was how phobias are formed. Phobias are fear disproportionate to the circumstances or disproportionate to the object. You're more fearful of something than reality warrants. And what Watson did was he created in little Albert a phobia of not just white rats, but anything little and fuzzy. He later discovered that he could put like a little a fuzzball approximately the same size as the rat. Clearly not a white rat, but similar in appearance. And after that fear response was associated with the rat, any similar appearing object would elicit a similar response from little Albert. So he created this phobia of small white fuzzy objects in little Albert. Not the most ethical experiment. Interestingly, what that also details is how we extinguish phobias. You do it by reversing that process, right? Little Albert would be a very easy person to help get over his fear of little white rats. What you do is you continually, repeatedly introduce that little white rat to little Albert, but without the bell. And if you do that frequently enough, of course, initially, every time you present the rat, Albert's going to become anxious. But each time that you present the rat, he becomes anxious, but nothing bad happens. Subsequently, the next time you present the rat, gradually over time, Albert's anxiety reaction or fear reaction diminishes proportionally until eventually it disappears. Now you can speed this along a bit by doing things to help Albert kind of counter that fear response. Get him really relaxed. Introduce the rat while he's having fun. Things that are incompatible with a fear response. And of course, you're going to get that startle from Albert about the rat, but even if you do nothing other than just present the rat and nothing bad happens, and you present the rat and nothing bad happens, and you present the rat and nothing bad happens, and if you do that often enough and long enough, eventually that fear, the association with the previously neutral stimulus is going to disappear. And you can do this with nearly any phobia. Of course, the caveat being you have to be able to present it in such a way that you are not creating a fear response reinforcing the fear response. So, for example, you wouldn't necessarily want to do that with a dangerous animal, right? Or dangerous circumstances. So you would use that method of treating a phobia or other traumatic responses, which we'll talk about later today. You can extinguish those phobias as long as you can assure the safety of the person when you present the previously neutral stimulus, whatever it is the person is afraid of. Okay, and then another couple of things. The first one is fetishes. Same basic mechanism as a phobia. The phobia, something that is originally neutral, becomes fear-inducing because it's connected in some way. It's associated for the person with something painful or frightening, right? Little Albert, the buzzer, the white rat. The fetish is the same basic mechanism. Say lingerie, lacy lingerie. There is, contrary to what a lot of guys will tend to think, there is nothing inherently sexually arousing about lacy lingerie. If you show a young adolescent male who has never seen a picture or never been in the presence of a woman in lingerie, it's just going to be, like, what is that, a doily? It's not going to have any particular. It's not going to elicit any particular response for the kid. But if you repeatedly present a young man, I guess anybody, but particularly in this case, a young man with pictures of women in the lingerie, the picture of a scantily clad or a nude woman is inherently arousing for a male, with very, very few exceptions. Generally speaking, you show a young male that picture, he is going to have that response. He's going to have some degree of sexual arousal. If you repeatedly present that picture where the woman is clothed in lacy lingerie, eventually you are going to establish an association in which that instinctual sexual arousal response to the image of an attractive female becomes paired with the lingerie itself. And it can be almost any object, and Lord knows it has been for somebody somewhere, it's shoes or I don't know, you name any weird object, and people have created a sexual fetish around it because it is fairly easy. It's a very strong instinctual response that is fairly easy to create an association with inanimate objects. And again, same thing. How do you disconnect it? You disconnect it or how do you extinguish it, How do you get rid of the fetish? Well, you disconnect the inanimate object, in this case the lacy lingerie, from association with a female. Then you could do that simply, it would take a while, but you could do that just by presenting the underwear over and 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 over again without any associated image of a female, and probably, frankly, encouraging, presuming that the person doesn't want to have this fetish anymore, encouraging the person not to fantasize, not to create the image in his head. And of course, you can speed the extinction along, the extinguishing of that fetish, by presenting the lingerie and basically doing some classical conditioning, presenting the lingerie in the company of some sort of noxious stimulus, presenting the lingerie and spraying a really bad smell into the room. You can very, very quickly eliminate the fetish that way, especially if you pair it with a smell that creates a sense of nausea in the person. And that brings us to the last thing that I want to make sure I talked about as far as classical conditioning examples are concerned, and that is taste aversion. A good example of this is somewhere out west they were having problems, and I don't remember whether it was sheep and coyotes or stock, cattle and wolves, but we'll say cattle and wolves. I don't remember if that was it or not, but cattle and wolves. They were having problems with predation by wolves on the cattle. And some bright person said, well, hey, let's use classical conditioning. They probably didn't say it that way, but essentially. And what they did was they took a carcass of a cow and they injected it with something to cause nausea and vomiting in the wolves. And then they put that out. They put them out in several different places. And the wolves would come and feed on it, and they would get violently ill. And as a result, they would avoid cows. They would avoid anything that looked like a cow. In fact, it was so effective that if you saw wolves and then you brought a cow out toward them, they would flinch and run. Works very, very well. And again, with nausea. Nausea is a remarkably effective tool. It by and large is a one trial learning issue. And anybody who has ever gotten sick on cheap tequila will tell you, you get sick one time, you don't ever want it again, and the classical conditioning, and that connection has been made. You smell that tequila again, and you will feel nauseated. You get the response. Prior to getting sick on tequila, you smell it. You might not love the way it smells, but you don't smell it and immediately get nauseated. But you have somebody drink too much of that, they vomit. That is a very, very quick, and it makes sense. It's a survival mechanism, right? We are programmed to become very, very avoidant of foods that make us sick. And if you don't have that programming, you don't live very long. If you eat something that makes you very sick, and you don't learn to avoid that very quickly, you won't be around for very long. So, basic examples of classical conditioning. It is rampant in the world. Much learning takes place. Again, I think I've mentioned this a couple times now. Below the level of awareness. The thing about classical conditioning is you don't even need to know you're learning something. It can happen and you don't even know that that a certain pairing is being made. Okay, some vocabulary that we need to make sure we have down associated with the whole process of classical conditioning. The term that we use for the initial stage of learning a response, of that association between stimuli that is characteristic of classical conditioning, we call that acquisition. And it depends on a couple of things. One, it depends on something we call stimulus contiguity. This is basically just that the unconditioned stimulus needs to be close enough in time to the conditioned stimulus that the organism, the dog, whatever, is able to make a connection. In the case of Pavlov's dogs, what we're talking about would be that the food, the unconditioned stimulus, needs to be presented close enough in time to the conditioned stimulus, to the bell or the sound of whatever sort, that the dog can make a connection between the two. If you ring the bell and present the food within a couple of seconds, obviously the dog is going to make that connection. If you ring the bell and present the food half an hour later, in all likelihood, that association will never be established. So contiguity is important. Also important, novelty. The stimulus has to be something that's noticeable to the organism, to the person, to the dog, whatever. It has to be peculiar enough. It has to stand out enough from its environment. So it needs to be new so that it's noticeable. It needs to be relatively unique relative to everything else in the environment. For example, using the Pavlov's dog example again, if there are bells going off incessantly in the laboratory, trying to pair a bell and the food probably isn't going to work, because the bell wouldn't be peculiar enough. It wouldn't be unique enough in that environment if there's, like, again, if there's bells going off all the time. For the animal to make a connection between this one bell among many and the food, it's possible that the connection would be made, but it makes it less likely. And then obviously the threshold is important also. The intensity of whatever the stimulus is. It needs to be noticeable. So contiguity, novelty, peculiarity, and intensity. It's got to be close enough in time, and it's got to be noticeable in order for the association to be made. The opposite of acquisition, the opposite of that initial stage of establishing an association between stimuli, is extinction. That's the gradual weakening and disappearance of a conditioned response. So I think we talked about this in an earlier slide, but if you are ringing, Pavlov's dogs, if you're ringing the bell and presenting the food, and you ring the bell and present the food, ring the bell, present the food, eventually the dog is going to salivate to the sound of the bell. If you stop ringing the bell prior to the presentation of the food, over the course of a relatively short period of time, and we'll talk about why it's a relatively short period of time a little bit later, but over the course of a relatively short period of time, what's going to happen is that bell will lose the association with the food. The dog won't connect the sound of the bell with the presentation of the food anymore. So you stop ringing the bell over the course, and you don't ring it for a couple of weeks when the food is presented, and you start ringing the bell again, and the dog likely will not have a response to the bell. Or excuse me, if you're ringing the bell and not presenting the food, I got myself all turned around. If you're ringing the bell and not presenting the food, ring the bell, not present the food, ring the bell, not present the food. After a while, that bell ringing isn't going to make the dog salivate anymore. And again, it won't take very long. We'll talk about why in a little bit. It won't take very long if you're ringing that bell and not presenting the food, presenting the conditioned stimulus and not continuing to present the unconditioned stimulus. After a while, that association extinguishes. It goes away. So, interestingly, if you've done this, if you've extinguished this association, and you wait a little while. So you were ringing the bell. You established you created classical conditioning. You established an association between an unconditioned stimulus and a conditioned stimulus, the bell and the food. And then you decide, okay, we're going to extinguish it. So we continue ringing the bell, but we stop presenting the food over a relatively short period of time. The dog stops salivating to the sound of the bell because it's not pairing the bell and the food anymore. It's not associating them anymore. And then we stop ringing the bell, and we let it sit for a day or two or three. And then we suddenly ring the bell again. And what happens, probably isn't all that much of a surprise to you, is the dog salivates again. Now, if we continue at that point, if we ring the bell, the dog salivates, but we don't present the food, it's not going to take the dog long at all before, again, that'll be extinguished again. The bell will ring, and after a couple of trials of not presenting the food, the dog will stop having that salivation response. Will stop having the conditioned response because of the lack of presence of the unconditioned stimulus. So we call this spontaneous recovery, and it makes sense because you got to keep in mind, classical conditioning, all learning is understood as an evolutionary adaptation, right? It's a response to stimuli in the environment that increases the likelihood that we're going to survive. So it would make sense that, especially in the case like we've been talking about food, especially in the case of food, that if the presentation of food has been connected with, has been learned as an association with some other stimulus that has to be conditioned. So we learn there's a connection. When this happens, food tends to appear. And then all of a sudden, for some reason, food stops appearing. It's no longer associated. We lose that connection because whatever that conditioned stimulus is no longer paired with the presentation of the unconditioned stimulus, the food. But then all of a sudden, so the conditioned stimulus, whatever it is, something in the environment, a sound, or I don't know, change in the foliage, the leaves change or something, and that cues that there's food. But all of a sudden, the leaves change, or there's a certain sound or something, and the food is no longer presented, and we extinguish that response. We don't have the response anymore of expecting the food. And then nothing happens. The conditioned stimulus also disappears, but then it reappears 6 months later. It would make sense, just in a survival sense, that we would again respond to that because our brains have had that connection stored. Now, again, if that conditioned stimulus isn't pretty quickly again paired with the unconditioned stimulus, it'll re-extinguish itself and go away. So spontaneous recovery. And then the renewal effect. If a response is extinguished in a different environment than it was acquired, the extinguished response will reappear if the subject is returned to the original environment in which the acquisition took place. A little confusing. Think about it like this: you're Pavlov, and you've done your experiment in your laboratory, and you've demonstrated classical conditioning. You have taught the dogs to associate the sound of a bell with the presentation of a food to the point where now they are having the unconditioned response, salivation, to the conditioned stimulus, the bell. We've got all this really well established, and then the janitorial staff comes in and says, you know what, we've gotten instructions, we've got to clean this lab, thorough cleaning once every 6 months or something, so we're going to have you move across the hall to this other laboratory. Okay, all right, so you pack everything up, you get all the dogs packed up, you go over across the hall, you get everything reestablished in a new laboratory, and you continue your experiment. And the continuation in this next step in your experiment is, okay, we're going to see if we can extinguish the response. And so what we do to extinguish the response is we ring the bell and we don't present the food. And we ring the bell and we don't present the food, and we ring the bell and we don't present the food, and fairly quickly the dog stops salivating to the sound of the bell, logically. And we get all this taken care of. We got it properly extinguished. And, it only took a day or so for the janitorial staff to clean the old laboratory. So they get all done, they come back in and say, yep, you can move back into your original lab. We move back into the original lab, we get everything set up, we ring the bell, and the dog salivates, right? It was extinguished in a new environment. When we go back to the original environment and we ring the bell again, the dog salivates. And it's as if that environment is one of the factors that makes the bell unique. Now, if you ring the bell and don't present the food with enough repetitions, again, not very many, and again, we'll talk about why in a little bit, but if you ring the bell and you don't present the food, it'll re-extinguish very, very quickly. But when you first get back into that original environment where the association was created, even after you've extinguished it, you get back in that original environment, you ring the bell, the dog will salivate. Now, some of this might be spontaneous recovery, but we know this pattern. We've distinguished this this renewal effect, that if you put the person or the organism back in the original environment where the association was established, you get this response. And then a couple of other things just real quickly. Stimulus generalization, we talked about this, and this is the idea that an organism that has learned a response to a specific stimulus responds in the same way to new stimuli that are similar to the original stimulus. So in the Pavlov case, you ring a bell, you create the association between the ringing of a bell and the presentation of a food, and the bell you're using, it's an old-fashioned clang, clang, clang kind of bell, and it's a pretty good sized bell. And one day you come in and somebody took your damn bell. And so you look around and you're like, okay, well, here's one that's a little bit smaller. So the pitch is a little bit higher. Here's one that's a little bit smaller. We'll just use this one. And you ring the bell. And if the bell is close enough in sound to the original bell, the dog is going to have that salivation response. It's still going to it's still going to produce that conditioned response, even though the conditioned stimulus now is just a little bit different. Along the same lines, you go in, the original bell is missing, and you look around and all you can find is a tinker bell, right? Like a little tiny bell. The original bell was fairly substantial, and you look around and all you can find is this little bell that goes tinkle, tinkle, tinkle when you ring it. Whereas the original bell was fairly substantial. And you go and you try to continue running your experiment, and you go ding, ding, ding. And why isn't the dog salivating? Well, because this new stimulus is unique enough that it is discriminated from the original one. It's not similar enough to be connected to the original conditioned stimulus. Again, as I said earlier, one of the very first slides, this stuff is not novel to you probably. The vocabulary certainly is, but these ideas, I'm assuming you already know simply because we see this stuff every day. This is how we learn. This is how you train a dog. This is how you, interestingly, this is how you train a child. This is how we are trained by our environment, how we're conditioned by our environment. So you guys are familiar with that, with something like stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination as concepts. And all you got to do now is just pair the vocabulary with it. One quick note before we move on to talking about operant conditioning. One last note about classical conditioning. In terms of its application, it's actually the strategy, or forms the basis of the strategy that we use for treating phobias, as I noted earlier, but also for helping to manage some of the reactions that characterize PTSD. There's a treatment called systematic desensitization. And basically what this is that if you have something traumatic that has happened and it creates a PTSD reaction, PTSD basically being that you have a sufficiently frightening or threatening situation that your body makes an adjustment where it functions as if that threat level, whatever it is, combat, car accident, sexual assault, physical assault, whatever, that it's so intense that your body begins to behave as if the threat level remains high. So in that situation, so this is not a conscious belief that the threat level remains high, right? This is an example of how the idea of association is actually a useful idea. What we're talking about here is, in PTSD, is that you have the person walking, they have something traumatic happen, they're walking around thereafter, and they know consciously, rationally, that they're not in a similar level of danger on a day-to-day basis, a level of danger similar to that of whatever the traumatic event was. So they're walking around and they know logically that they're not in danger, and yet they'll talk in terms of my gut tells me, that they have this animal instinct that is telling them that they're in danger of losing their life, or somebody they love is in danger of losing their lives, or whatever. But there's a high threat level. And so say you develop a PTSD reaction because you're in a bad car accident, and so thereafter, anytime you get in a car, you develop this intense fear that you're going to die, which is on an animal level, on a non-rational level, makes some good sense, right? You were in a circumstance, that circumstance turned out to be very, very dangerous, nearly killing you. And so your animal brain creates this association between pain and the car. And systematic desensitization is essentially a strategy using classical conditioning in which we take the person, in this case, the person who is in a car accident, we take this person and we teach them strategies to manage their anxiety level, this like deep breathing, like relaxation breathing, perhaps meditation. We might use some psychotropics, we might use some medicines to help them control their anxiety. And then once they get a good handle on how to do this, just generally, how to manage their anxiety just generally, what we would do is we would systematically, gradually reintroduce them to being in automobiles and eventually driving again. So at first that might just be standing next to their car or standing next to their car and putting their hand on it. It might be opening the door and sitting in the car. Each time using deep breathing and other relaxation strategies to reduce the level of anxiety. And we would have them just sit with it until the anxiety level, what we're doing is we're extinguishing that response, right? So they're sitting in the car and nothing bad is happening. And gradually, as they do their breathing and such, the anxiety level diminishes. And then perhaps they turn the car on and their anxiety level goes back up. And they sit and they do the deep breathing and nothing bad is happening. No, they're not in pain. And the longer that goes on, just like it does for Pavlov's dog, when you stop presenting the food when you ring the bell, that anxiety diminishes as the pain doesn't ever show up. The car's on, I'm not hurting, right? Again, this is not happening at the level of logic and rationality. This is happening at a deeper kind of animal level. And we continue to systematically move them forward into circumstances that more and more and more closely resemble whatever the traumatic event was, until eventually we get them driving. Of course, their anxiety comes up. They drive around, say, in a parking lot, so there's no other traffic or anything, and their anxiety level goes up. We have them pause as they need to. We have them do the breathing until they're able to drive around the parking lot and not have undue anxiety. And then we eventually have them get on quiet streets. Same thing. The anxiety level goes up. We have them control. Systematic desensitization, which is essentially the use of extinction in the classical conditioning model to help eliminate some of the symptoms of PTSD. So just an interesting factoid about the actual application of classical conditioning in clinical practice. Okay, so now we're going to switch tracks and we're going to talk about operant conditioning, which is generally more interesting because it's more obviously applicable to our daily lives. So operant conditioning, defined as a form of learning in which voluntary responses come to be controlled by their consequences. You can think about this kind of like as in an evolutionary sense. It's like natural selection for behavior, right? Natural selection would be that there are certain traits in an organism that increase the likelihood of the organism surviving. In other words, the environment responds positively to certain physical traits or behavioral traits in an organism, and so those are selected for, and they're more likely that they lead to a greater likelihood of survival, meaning they're more likely to be expressed by subsequent generations, right? Natural selection. Same basic thing, just on the behavioral level within the lifespan of an individual organism. And the guy who came up with this, or come up with it, it's been there forever and ever and ever. He just identified it and defined it and built a theory on it. Was a guy named B.F. Skinner, a psychologist named B.F. Skinner. Built an entire career around this basic idea, which you will come to see you already know. Everybody is familiar with this. It's just simply operationalizing something that we see every day in the environment. B.F. Skinner made the famous statement in laying out operant conditioning that organisms tend to repeat responses that are followed by favorable consequences. Another way of saying this would be whether or not a person continues to demonstrate a behavior is largely contingent on the nature of reinforcement or punishment that follows. So in other words, if you do something and it causes you pain or discomfort, you're less likely to continue to do that thing. If you do something and you are rewarded in some way by if you do something and it produces a positive feeling afterwards, you're more likely to continue to engage in that behavior because it felt good, it was productive. So very, very simple idea that we have operationalized, we've carefully defined. So these consequences that I've already referred to, which you break down basically into two fundamental categories, reinforcement and punishment, right? So we have two forms of consequences that can result from a behavior. Reinforcement would be, and this is important to get this straight in your head about what reinforcement and punishment are, because they're not necessarily exactly what you think. Reinforcement is any event following a response, following a behavior, that increases an organism's tendency to make that response. So reinforcement leads to the tendency to continue to make a response. It increases the likelihood that an organism is going to make a response. This is important. So we have two types of reinforcement. We have positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. And positive reinforcement is a reward. Positive reinforcement is you do something and you get rewarded for it. You engage in a behavior and the consequences are pleasant. Then there is the opposite of positive reinforcement, and that is negative reinforcement, which is something unpleasant is going on, and you engage in a particular behavior, and that unpleasant stimulus is eliminated. So, classic example of negative reinforcement would be torture, or the "I'm not touching you" technique, right? Somebody puts their finger out on right next to your head and says, "I'm not touching you, I'm not touching you, I'm not touching you, I'm not touching you, I'm not touching you," until you get up out of the chair and clear out. And then they stop doing it because they got what they wanted. Torture, which is, I guess that is kind of a mild form of torture. Torture would be, the bad guy planted a bomb somewhere, and so we subject him to discomfort until he tells us what we want, and then we stop torturing him, we stop making him suffer, right? And that increases the likelihood he's going to continue to comply with us. So positive reinforcement is a reward. Negative reinforcement is the removal of an aversive stimulus. So the removal, the discontinuation of something unpleasant. So reinforcement, event following a response, increases the organism's tendency to make that response. You do something, you're rewarded for it, you're more likely to make that response. Something bad is going on, you do something and that bad thing stops, you're more likely to continue doing whatever it was that made the pain stop, right? The other basic category of consequences of a behavior would be punishment, and that is the opposite of reinforcement. An event following a response weakens the organism's tendency to make that response. And similar to reinforcement, positive reinforcement is a reward. Positive punishment, which is a weird way of talking, but positive punishment is the introduction of an aversive stimulus. It's a punishment. It's what we think of when we think of punishment, right? So you do something that I don't want you to do, and when you do it, I smack you in the back of the head. That's positive punishment. Positive in this case doesn't mean that it's a nice thing or it's a good thing. Positive in this sense means we introduce something. We're adding something in. In this case, we're adding in an aversive stimulus. Positive reinforcement is we're adding in a reward. Negative reinforcement is we're removing something. In this case, we're removing an aversive stimulus, right? So negative reinforcement is removing an aversive stimulus. Positive punishment is introducing an aversive stimulus. It's a punishment. Negative punishment would be the withdrawal of a positive stimulus. Some examples of a negative punishment. The classic thing that you're supposed to do if a dog is jumping on you, right? So especially like with puppies and stuff, you get home from being out and well, if they're really young and you're still trying to house train them, you might have them in their kennel. And you get home and you open up the door and they jump up and down. Of course, if it's a really little puppy, they're going to jump up and down on you, and they're probably going to pee on you because they get so excited. Well, one of the strategies, one of the most effective strategies for stopping a dog from jumping on you is presuming that the jumping isn't aggressive. They're friendly and they're excited and they jump on you, like puppies do. The best response to this, for the long-term health of the dog and the long-term behavior, the cooperative behavior of the dog, is negative punishment. You're facing the dog starts jumping on you, you turn away from the dog and you withdraw your attention from the dog. And of course, what does the dog do? He kind of tries to come around and get in front of you again, and you turn away from him again, and you continue withdrawing your attention. That's the positive stimulus. That's the most positive stimulus for mammals, is the attention of loved ones or of other significant mammals. So same thing that we use with kids. If a kid is I don't know, the kids generally being a butthead, right? They're being disobedient. You got a 5-year-old kid, and they're in a grumpy mood for whatever reason, and they're just making your life miserable, and you're trying to make dinner, right? You keep this in mind. Remember this, because when you have kids someday, you're going to want to have this stuff available to you. So you got a little kid, and you're working on dinner, and that little kid is just being a pest, and it's that whiny being a pest. It's not happy and excited, and the kid is continually eliciting your attention, and every time you turn toward that kid, and he's being whiny and annoying, and so you keep turning toward him and giving him, and you might think you're punishing him, and I guess in a way you probably are punishing them, because you're probably, like if you're snapping at them, you're introducing an aversive stimulus. You're being unpleasant toward him. But this is where all this gets complicated. If what he wants out of that situation is the reward of your attention, and that is the only way, perhaps in this circumstance, because you're busy, that he can get your attention, then every time you turn toward him to rebuke him for bothering you, you're giving him attention, which is you're making an effort to punish him because you're scowling at him and telling him no, but you are giving him the attention that he is seeking, and so inadvertently you're actually also partially rewarding that behavior. So the behaviorist would say, well, let's break this cycle where you're kind of simultaneously punishing and rewarding. Punishing by being grumpy toward him when he bugs you, but inadvertently rewarding him by giving him the attention that he's seeking. So we avoid that by not using positive punishment, the grumpiness, not using positive reinforcement, the reward, but instead go with negative punishment. Withdraw the possibility of a positive stimulus, send him to his room. Or better yet, because rooms can actually be reinforcing too, because there's all sorts of fun toys and stuff in there, potentially could be reinforcing. Make him go stand in the corner. Make him go sit in a chair in a room by themselves, right? So what we've done is we've withdrawn the positive stimulus. This would also be the same thing as a kid gets a bad grade, so we punish him by taking the cords to the video games, taking the charging cord for the phone, and removing that positive stimulus, right? So he does something we don't want him to continue to do, and we want to punish it. We want to weaken his tendency to make bad grades. So, you could give him a spanking. You could that would be a positive punishment, ironically. But given the child a spanking, introducing an aversive stimulus, it might work, but it's fairly short-lived, and it's not as obviously and logically connected to the misbehavior. The most effective strategy for shaping behavior is choosing either reinforcement or punishment that is logically connected to the problem behavior or to the behavior you want to reinforce. In this case, you got a problem behavior, bad grades, and we're kind of operating on the assumption here that the kid got bad grades because he wasn't studying enough, probably because he was on the phone with his friends, on social media, using video games, this kind of thing, distractions from the studying. So a logical punishment would be negative punishment. Let's remove positive stimuli. Let's remove the opportunity for video games, remove the opportunity for social media, and remove opportunity for socialization with friends. Now, so you got the basic picture. You got reward, positive reinforcement, reward, negative reinforcement, which is you remove an aversive or unpleasant situation when the person does what you want them to do. Positive punishment, which is punishment, and then negative punishment, which is removing a positive stimulus when they do something that you don't want them to do. Effective shaping of behavior, effective parenting, whether it's of a kid or a pet or whatever, parenting is much more likely, parenting, managing a classroom, coaching a team becomes much, much more effective if you do not limit yourself, like we often do, to just two options, right? We generally think of say disciplining kids or raising kids in terms of reward and punishment, positive reinforcement, reward, and positive punishment, which we generally just call punishment. So they do something you like, you reinforce it, you reward it. They do something you don't like, and you do something to make them cry. You introduce something unpleasant, so it might be spanking them or yelling at them. Yelling at somebody is a punishment, right? You're introducing an aversive stimulus to reduce the likelihood they're going to engage in a particular behavior. You have twice as many options available if you also avail yourself of the opportunity or of the options of using negative reinforcement. So they do something that you don't want them, or I'm sorry, we remove. I'm getting myself all turned around. Let's talk about negative punishment. I'll get that out of the way, and then I'll go back to negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement. We don't just use punishment, positive punishment. We also use negative punishment, and that would be essentially things like turning our attention away from something when it's unpleasant. This works really well with little kids because little kids thrive on our attention. And so if they do something that you don't like them to do, and you very concretely turn away and withdraw from the kid. The nice thing about that is it doesn't require you to invest a whole lot of time and energy. You actually you can preserve your energy because you're actually doing less. You're pulling away. And then conversely, when the kid's doing something you want, say the kids have been it's a rainy day and you're babysitting, or they're your own kids, God forbid, right? So it's a rainy afternoon. They've been inside all day. They're a bunch of 4 and 5 year old kids, so they're noisy and they're loud and they're rambunctious and they're driving you crazy. And so you go, okay, everybody come here. Let's go see. And you sit them down at the kitchen table, say, and you get out coloring books and the big boxes of what is it, 64 count boxes of crayons, and you put them to work. And then, you have them drawing stuff and coloring stuff and so on and so forth. And thank God for the moment they're quiet, right? And so the normal tendency that we would have, now they're doing what we want them to do, right? The normal tendency would be like, oh, thank goodness. And we get to go do our work, I don't know, making dinner or doing whatever that they were interrupting right before. But the problem is that one of the most positive things for a kid, one of the strongest reinforcers for a child is attention. And so we finally get them doing what we want them to do, and then we withdraw the attention, which is actually negative punishment. It's making it less likely that they will continue. As soon as their attention begins to waver from the coloring, they're done, right? So we get them coloring, we go and we do a little bit of our work, and then we come back and we reward them. And it doesn't have to be anything, it doesn't have to be like, oh, I'm so excited, you're coloring, good job. No, you don't have to make a big deal out of it. Reinforcement can be something as subtle as walking over and patting them on the head, or rubbing them on the back, or giving them a kiss as you walk by, smooch them on the top of the head as you walk by. That's reinforcement, and they might startle and go, oh, look at my drawing. Oh, that's a really good drawing. You're doing a good job. I'll check back with you in a few minutes, right? So we're reinforcing them continuing to engage in that behavior, right? So reward, a positive reinforcement reward, positive punishment, smacking them or yelling at them or whatever. Negative punishment, withdrawal of a positive stimulus. So we often inadvertently use negative punishment when it is counterproductive. And then negative reinforcement, which is removing something that's unpleasant to elicit a desired behavior. So an example of negative punishment, or excuse me, negative reinforcement in an everyday kind of raising kids sort of a thing. So I talked before about using negative punishment. The kid gets a bad grade, say, okay, negative punishment. I'm going to remove the distractions from the kid, the video games and the telephone and all that kind of stuff. That tends to work very well, particularly if you remove the charging cords, because then the kid is sitting there and they're gradually watching the battery drain from their phone, so it's a really strong punishment, right? And because it's not just a moment, it's lasting and lasting. It's being reinforced every time they look down, and there's less of a percentage of their battery left over, right? So they've lost it. They lost it from everything. Of course, they're pissed off and they're grumpy and everything, and they don't really want to study. And so they're sitting in the room and they're pouting and everything, and you walk by and they're pouting. So you say, okay, well, I'm not going to give them any attention, right? So negative punishment still. I'm not giving them any attention. They're being grumps. They're being unpleasant. They're not doing what I want them to do. And then I don't know, you call them for dinner and they come down and they're kind of grumpy and they sit down. They sit, because they're mad at you for taking their stuff, and they sit down, mommy comes into the room or daddy comes in the room, whichever one you aren't, because we're mad at you right now, and they're friendly and pleasant toward the other parent, right? And they're polite and they actually eat all their dinner, and they start to get up from the table, and you say, you need to take your plates out and put them in the sink and wash them. And so they kind of grump a little bit as they walk in, and they put the plates in, they wash. They do what you told them to do, and they were nice to their parent. And so after dinner, you walk into the room and you say, you know what? I know you're in a bad mood. I know you're mad at me, but you did such a good job. You did such a you were nice at dinner. You washed your plate like I asked you to. I know I said I was taking the cords in your phone for the next week because you didn't get good grades, whatever it is, for the next week. But you know what? You were so nice about that. I'm going to shorten it by 4 hours. So what you've done, that's negative reinforcement, right? They have an unpleasant stimulus, this having their stuff taken away, that has gotten shortened now. You've lifted some of it because they did something you want them to do. And you might even, sometimes you can do that just that subtly. You can kind of watch for something positive and then reinforce it, use negative reinforcement by reducing the punishment, right, that was previously instituted. Or you can do it very explicitly. You can say, you know what, I'll tell you what. For every hour of studying you do, that we document, so I see you doing it, for every hour of studying that you do, I will drop 3 hours of your punishment. So every hour of studying you do gets your phone back 3 hours earlier. Every other hour, so until eventually, so that they can earn that phone back pretty quickly that way, right? They do 4 or 5 hours of studying over the course of the week, and that's a lot of hours off of that week of punishment, right? So that's negative reinforcement, a very effective tool. So you can see how using reward, negative reinforcement, punishment, and negative punishment gives you so many more options to shape behavior. Please store this away, because this is the kind of thing that makes parenting so much more effective, so much more pleasant, and leads to less fighting, especially if you start it when the kids are very young. Okay, so a few other comments about operant conditioning. Some of these I may have already actually touched on. The first one is just kind of, I want to make sure it's registering. We talk about, when we talk about working with children and animals and such, and we talk about discipline. And unfortunately, often what ends up happening is that we use the word discipline essentially to mean punishment, as if the only way to shape behavior is by punishing it, by using aversive stimulus. The reality is, I kind of mentioned this before, the reality is you are going to be much more effective if there is a balance between positive and negative reinforcement and positive and negative punishment. And frankly, ideally, if you want to shape behavior, especially in the context of a relationship that you want to sustain, say a parent-child relationship, leaning toward using positive reinforcement and negative punishment. Not that you don't ever use positive punishment or negative reinforcement, but using reward and using negative punishment, frankly, are probably the more desirable and effective techniques, especially if you want the person whose behavior you're trying to shape to actually like you. Of course, it helps if you act as if you like that person too. But keeping in mind the idea just that that discipline is essentially the shaping of behavior with a desire to create good character, and the more balanced you are between positive and negative punishment, positive and negative reinforcement, the more effective the discipline is going to be. The second of the 3 points that I just want to make sure I made, I have already spoken to, and that is the idea that not all punishment is obvious and not all reinforcement is obvious. Withdrawing attention. Yeah, withdrawing attention would be a good example. Withdrawing attention um, in the hopes of reducing, somebody's doing something you don't want them to do, so you withdraw your attention from them. That's a negative punishment. And it doesn't leap out at you. In fact, oftentimes the person from whom you've withdrawn the attention may not even necessarily consciously recognize what you've done. We do this all the time to shape one another socially. Somebody does something that's awkward, and you avert eye contact and you kind of turn away like this, and that's negative punishment, right? We're trying to reduce the behavior, punishment. So we're stopping something, negative, stopping something, reduce the behavior, punishment. So not all punishment is obvious, and not all reinforcement is obvious. The subtle, somebody's doing something that you want them to do, the subtle smile, pat on the back, even just kind of a lean in, closing social distance a little bit with them. These subtle reinforcers that you can use, they are rewards, the reinforcers, actually can be very, very effective, partly because the person is not necessarily aware that they are being rewarded. And then the last thing I want to make sure I mentioned about operant conditioning is spanking, because spanking is something of a political football, frankly. There's a lot of controversy about it. There's frankly a lot of bad research out there. Bad research, one of the ways of designating bad research is research where people have identified the outcome that they want. In other words, they've figured out what they want the research to say, and then they shape the study, they shape the experiment, they shape the research itself in order to get the outcome that they want. They manipulate the statistics, etc., to get the outcome that they believe is true. And frankly, there's a fair amount of that going on around the issue of spanking. One thing, okay, so spanking is positive punishment. Not that it's good punishment, positive punishment in that you're introducing an aversive stimulus to reduce a certain kind of behavior. Now, there are some contexts in which spanking is a negative and shouldn't be used. The first one is obviously excessive force, where you're actually going to damage the person, obviously not desirable. And then the other piece of it is it shouldn't be used when you're angry. And the reason for this is you complicate the use of it as punishment when you introduce an emotional response. You personalize it. Any punishment, right? The most effective punishment coming from an authority figure is the punishment reluctantly administered. So what I'm talking about here is, somebody does something wrong, and you institute whatever the punishment, you ground them, right? Although you could make the argument, you could make the argument that might be negative punishment. And regardless, somebody does something you don't want them to do. It's your kid. You ground your kid because they did something that you don't want them to do. And you have two, I guess there are other ways too, but for our purposes, you have two basic ways you could administer the punishment. The first one is, damn it, I told you not to do that. Yell, yell, yell. You're grounded for the rest of your life. Or more appropriately, you're grounded for a discrete amount of time that isn't overwhelming, right? Because if you ground them for too long, if you go all the way to the wall, you actually make the punishment less productive. Quick aside, the ideal punishment is the least amount of aversive stimulus that you can possibly use to produce the desired effect. So in other words, when you're thinking about punishment, you're not thinking in terms of What's the most I can do? How can I really punish them? What you really should be thinking about is, what is the least amount I can do that gets the attention the way I want it? So not how long can I ground them, but how short can I ground them? Not how hard can I spank them, but how softly can I spank them to get the response, the reduction of the behavior that I want. And part of the reason for that is if you go too far and the child continues to misbehave, you have limited options moving forward, right? If you ground them for the rest of their lives, you can't ground them any longer than that. On the other hand, if you know that this particular kid has things coming up over the next week, you could ground them just long enough, just on the other side of that desired event. And now, another thing to keep in mind is if you do that, you have the option, so you've introduced an aversive stimulus, the punishment itself, right? You have the option of using negative reinforcement. You have the option of, kind of like what I was talking about earlier, when you watch them and you catch them doing the right things. You punish them for, you ground them for being rude to you. They were disrespectful to you, so you ground them. You're grounded for a week. Oh, but I've got this, this date coming up, or this dance, or I'm going to a football game on Friday. No, you're not. You're grounded for a week. But then you monitor them, and you watch, and anything approaching polite behavior, the desired behavior, the opposite of what they got grounded for, and you use negative reinforcement. Okay. You tell them to do something and they don't roll their eyes and they don't, huff at you. They actually do what you ask them to do and they're actually fairly pleasant about it. Or they're pleasant to you in an interaction at dinner or something like that. And you point it out to them, you know what, this is exactly what I was wanting from you. That I grounded you because, frankly, you were mean to me. And you're doing exactly what I so want from you. It's only fair. I'm gonna shorten the grounding, and you don't shorten it enough that they get what they want. You shorten it just enough to give them hope, and to shift yourself from the column of being the bad guy to being the good guy, right? And then what you get from them is the motivation. Oh, wait a minute. You're using reinforcement for what we want reinforcement used for, which is we want to increase the likelihood of that desired behavior, the polite behavior, the nice behavior. And so they go, oh, wait a minute. Okay. Well, maybe I'll be nice more. Maybe they'll shorten my grounding more. And so they do it a little bit more, and they do it a little bit more. And again, as with punishment, the reinforcement is little. You use as little reinforcement as you can to elicit the desired behavior. So you don't take off big chunks of the grounding. You take off just enough of the grounding to make yourself kind of temporarily no longer the bad guy. You're kind of the good guy now because you did something nice. And so they're more inclined to be nice to you. And every time they're nice to you, you budge a little bit more. And eventually you budge enough, hopefully you budge enough that they get to go do what they want to do. Now everybody's happy. They're being nice and they got to go do what they want to. And they're being nice to you, so you're happy, and they got to go do what they wanted to do. If you're thinking to yourself, yeah, but they're just going to behave because they're going to want to get what they want. Well, that's the way the world works, right? That's why we do things. That's why we behave the way we're supposed to behave, so we can get what we want. There's nothing wrong with that. That's not a bad thing for them to do. So anyway, I went down that line to say to you that you want to use as mild a stimulus as you can, both in reinforcement and in punishment. Regarding spanking, you want to use it as little as possible, as gently as possible. So the last thing you want to do is be angry, right? When you're angry, that's right. That's where I was going. When you're angry, if you're spanking when you're angry, now it's no longer just a punishment, just the introduction of an aversive stimulus. Now it's personal. I'm doing this because I'm mad at you, not because I'm trying to shape your behavior, right? The ideal punishment is the one, I started to use grounding as an example. The ideal punishment is the one where you kind of like, oh, you know what the consequences for this. Like the person is rude to you, so you've already established, this is good discipline approach, by the way. You've already established what the costs of rudeness are. It's already been established that if you're rude to an adult, you get a certain period of grounding within a certain range. And that way it allows you to be the reluctant disciplinarian. You know the rules. The consequences for this are grounding. You know, you don't want to do it. You're obligated to do it, right? So it's not personal. When my kids were little, we used spanking when my kids were little in only really one context, and that was defiance. You know, so if you told them to do something, you know, if you said, don't, you know, something's on the table and it's fragile, don't touch that thing, and they give you the eye contact and they touch the thing, like, screw you. Defiance, that warrant, you know, that's a power move. It warrants a spanking, you know. So the response from us, from me and my wife, when the kids were little, in that situation would be like, oh, disappointment, really strong disappointment. You know what the rules are. If I tell you to do something and you don't do it, you get a spanking. And then you walk over and you grab them on the shoulder and you give them a whap on the bottom, because they didn't get spankings very often. They're generally pretty good kids. And just that whap on the bottom was usually enough to, oh, they weep and they cry and everything. And, you know, and you'd say to them, okay, go up to your room, cry a little bit. I'll come up and check on you in a little bit, right? So you're emphasizing to them, I'm not mad at you. This was a punishment. That's the capital T, capital R, the rules, right? You earned it. I gave it to you. So they go up to the room and they're crying and everything. You give them a little bit of time, let them calm down, and then you go upstairs, and you know, and you sit down on the bed with them and you say, okay, you know, do you understand why I gave you the spanking? you gave me the spanking because, you know, and you get them to lay it out. And if they lay it out, yeah, you're rewarding this now. That you're being extra nice and you're patting them on the back. Yep, I gave you the spanking because I told you not to touch the thing on the table, and you looked at me and you touched it on purpose, right? And you can't do that. You know, and maybe you lay it out for you. You can provide a little explanation for why obeying mommy and daddy is important. We always used to make sure that we threw in, because we want to emphasize this, not personal. You know, are you okay? Yeah. Are you going to do that again? No, I'm not going to do it again. You know, and you know that even when I have to punish you, I still love you. Yeah, I know. Okay, give me a hug, right? So you're walking them through it and making sure that it's not personal, that the punishment is predictable. They know what's coming, and that the punishment is as little as possible. You're limiting it. And again, we're not just talking about punishment. We're also talking about reward. If every time the kid does something desirable, you make a big deal out of it. Oh my gosh, you're so great. You're so wonderful. Well, then they're going to expect that every time, right? And that's a lot of work. So instead of going overboard with the reinforcement, kindergarten teachers and preschool teachers and babysitters do this, you know, or especially when they're new at their jobs. And it's just so draining. It takes so much energy, when all that really is necessary is a little eye contact and a smile, right? So there are some things that you can do in terms of titrating the dose. That's the way we talk about it in psychology. You titrate the dose of the reinforcement and the punishment to make it more effective long term. Last thing I want to mention that's not on the little bulleted list there is the idea of timeouts. And I want to draw a distinction between timeouts and punishment, right? So you have a negative punishment, which is you remove something positive to reduce an undesired behavior, right? So this would be like, go to your room or go sit in the corner, right? We're removing them from the fun because they did something we don't want them to do. So negative punishment. You want to make it, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? There's nothing wrong with go to your room. You did something, you know, you're being too noisy. I already told you once to please quiet down. You didn't do it. You got to go to your room, you know, for X amount of minutes. Again, as brief as possible to elicit unhappiness. You got to distinguish that from a timeout, because what a timeout actually started out as, and what it is most useful as, is a way of helping a child who is overstimulated manage it, right? So if you get a kid and you put them in, you take them to Chuck E. Cheese's, God forbid. You take them to Chuck E. Cheese's and it's noisy and it's rambunctious and there's lights and there's sounds and it's like adult hell, right? But little kids love it. They like that high stim environment most of the time, most kids. But for some kids, they have a threshold, and once they get beyond it, it's too much, and they'll get real hyperactive and perhaps irritable. In that situation where your judgment is that they're not intentionally misbehaving, they're overstimulated, they're over-aroused. What you want to do is you want to remove them from that situation into a lower stimulation environment and help them calm themselves down. You don't want this to be experienced as a punishment, because if you do that, then in the future, when they need to be removed from those high stimulation environments, or when they need to remove themselves from that high stimulation environment because it's too much, they'll be reluctant to cooperate because it's been framed as something negative, as a punishment, right? So there is the punishment of, I'm taking away something fun. You know, I'm taking you away from the party because you were mean to that other kid, right? Where you're pretty certain it was intentional. That's a punishment. That's negative punishment. As opposed to a timeout where the kid's like freaking out and losing their mind and running around and just making chaos because they're too excited, you know, and you go over and you get their attention and you say, come with me. And you may have to say it fairly forcefully to make sure that they understand you mean business. And you get them out of there, you put your hand on their shoulder, and, you know, there are circumstances where some of this stuff isn't appropriate, but in most cases, say it's your kid, you put your hand on your shoulder, you say, you know, take a breath with me. Okay, take a breath. All right, I'm going to slow down a little bit. I was worried you were going to get in trouble because you were really getting loud in there. Too loud, like too loud for an inside voice. We're talking to a 5-year-old. Hey, it's my made up situation. It's a 5-year-old. You know, okay, so you know, you were getting pretty loud and you hand on the shoulder, so you're calming them down, you're patting them. This is reinforcement because right now they're quiet. They're doing what you want them to do. They cooperated. They came out of the thing, so you're giving them good eye contact, attention, patting them on the back, reinforce, reinforce, reinforce. Take some breaths. Okay, I want you to sit down here. Just take a couple of breaths, okay? I'm gonna go get you, and you do something to keep them in that place. I'm gonna go get you a glass of water or a glass of whatever. I'll be back in just a minute. You stay right there. Can you stay right there? You get an agreement from them. I'll stay right here. Go get the glass of water. You don't give them very long because you don't want them to disobey you, right? You want them to cooperate. So you leave them sitting for as long, and you might even go out and kind of monitor them and watch them to make sure that they're staying where they are. And when they start to get a little restless, you go back in and you reinforce them. You give them the water. You sit down. You talk to them. Pat them on the back. You know, you check in with them to make sure. Do you know why I removed you from the party? You know, how'd you come out of the party? Yeah, it was really exciting and I got too excited. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So do you think you can go back to the party now? And of course they're going to say, yeah, I think I can. And when they say that, you plan, you anticipate consequences, right? So you walk them through it. Okay, so when you go back to the party, what are you going to do? You know, I'm not going to be loud. Right. You're going to use basically your inside voice, right? Yep, I'm going to use my inside voice. And if you start getting too excited again, you let me know and we'll come back out here, right? Because what you're wanting to see them, you're wanting them to see this as a positive thing. Timeouts are good. They're not bad. Grounding is, or being taken away from the party, being made to go stand in the corner is bad. That's a punishment. Timeout should not be a punishment. If you take away the timeout, you're taking away from yourself a tool that you can use to help the child learn how to manage hyperarousal, overarousal, right? Okay. So we're going to shift from talking about classical conditioning and operant conditioning to the reinforcement that we use. Talk a little bit more about the reinforcement that we use in conditioning someone. And in this case, we're talking specifically in terms of the reinforcement that we use in operant conditioning. And what we're concerning ourselves with here is the schedule, so to speak, of the reinforcement. How we're administering the reinforcement to elicit a desired behavior. So we have some vocabulary that we use we talk about continuous reinforcement, which is the reinforcement every time you get a desired response, you give them a reinforcement. The classic example is, the example we use would be, you have a rat in a box, and what you're trying to do is you're trying to teach the rat, there's a lever at one end of the box, and you're trying to train the rat to press that lever, right? And one way of doing that is every single time that the rat presses that lever, a food pellet comes out, right? So pretty quickly, well, scratch that. I'm going to back up just a little bit. So part of the problem you've got in that situation is how to get the rat to press the lever in the first place, right? So the strategy that we use is what the psychobabble for this is reinforcing successive approximations of a desired behavior. And basically all this means is that, using that rat example, at first the rat's kind of just wandering around randomly. The lever doesn't mean anything to the rat, So what we do is when we notice the rat take a couple of steps toward the lever, a pellet is released. They go over and they eat the pellet, and they wander some more kind of randomly because they don't get the connection yet. They take a couple of steps toward the lever, a pellet pops out. They go eat the pellet. And relatively quickly, continuously, every time they take a couple steps toward that lever, the pellet pops out. So they get the association. This is classical conditioning. They get the association between the behavior and the reinforcement. Excuse me, operant conditioning. I said classical conditioning. Operant conditioning. Toward the behavior, the couple steps toward the lever, pellet pops out. They go to eat the pellet. They wander some more. They make that connection very quickly, so they're starting to make steps toward it. So now what we do is we make the pellet, once they've learned 2 or 3 steps toward the lever produces a pellet. Now what we do is we raise the stakes a little bit. Now we make it 4 or 5 steps toward the lever before they get the pellet. And we do that 3 or 4 times. And now they've learned, okay, 5 steps. And then, so now they're starting to spend a lot of time around that lever, kind of watching for the food to come out, the pellet to come out. And when it doesn't come out, they do what's worked so far. And as they move toward the lever. And so now we've got them where they're basically right up against the lever all the time, hoping for the food. And then what you raise the level again, to raise the stakes again, or raise the expectations again. And now it has to be, you have to touch the lever. And so they bump it and the pellet comes out. And they wander, they're hanging out, they bump it again accidentally at first, and a pellet comes out. And pretty quickly they make that association, I've got to actually make physical contact. And then you raise the stakes a little bit further. Now it's actually got to depress the lever, right? And what they'll do is they'll be bumping it, and then they'll, because they're trying to provoke that food response after the first several. And the closer they get to pushing down the lever, the more likely you are to give them the pellet until eventually they get the connection, and now they're pressing the lever and a pellet comes out. And if they press the lever and a pellet comes out every time, that's called a continuous reinforcement schedule. So the nice thing about this is they very rapidly learn, press the lever, get the pellet. It establishes the response very quickly. The problem is that as soon as that pellet stops appearing when they press the lever, or nearly as soon as the pellet stops appearing when they press the lever, they're likely to lose interest and walk away, right? So it extinguishes very quickly. A slightly better strategy would be what we call fixed interval. So fixed interval would be that we reinforce something after a certain period of time. So this would be that, the rat presses the lever and for every 5 minutes or every 60 seconds, let's say, or every 30 seconds that it presses the lever, every 30 seconds, a pellet comes out, right? So the upside of this is you can get the desired behavior, in this case the lever pressing, which should increase as the rat kind of acquires the behavior. It recognizes, okay, that 30-second threshold is starting to come up, and we'll start pressing the thing more. So you're getting more and more of that behavior as the interval approaches. But again, the problem is that once you stop giving that anticipated reinforcement at the established intervals, it almost immediately stops responding. So the example here on the chart that I have up here for you for human beings, since we're not asking you to press a lever, would be a weekly quiz. Same basic idea. You can move this a little bit. You can make this a little bit more resistant to extinction. In other words, you get the person to persist a little bit more by changing it to a variable interval. So in other words, we have a formula for, you press a lever, and the first time you press a lever it's 15 seconds, and the second time you press a lever it's 20 seconds, and the third time you press a lever it's 8 seconds, and the fourth time you press a lever it's 25 seconds. And so that the unreliability of it, the unpredictable nature of it, means that what the rat's going to do is it's going to hang out there, and it's just going to keep pressing that because it doesn't really know what the interval is. And so what that does is that it keeps it working. It makes it a little more resistant to extinction, right? It makes it a little less likely to be extinguished if you aren't as reliable with the intervals. A fourth of the 5 general strategies that we use for schedules of reinforcement is what we call a fixed ratio. And fixed ratio is basically just, you train the rat to figure out that you get a pellet every 5 times you press the lever. And so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, get a lever. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, get a pellet. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, get a pellet. So the good thing about this is you're producing a lot of responses, but the bad thing is kind of like it was with the continuous and the fixed interval reinforcement schedules, is that they don't tend to keep doing it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, nothing happened. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, nothing happened. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, nothing. Okay, screw it, I'm not doing it anymore, right? So they walk away from it relatively quickly. The magical reinforcement schedule is what we call variable ratio. And it's the same thing as a variable interval, but rather than being a time period, it's a response ratio. So, the first time you got to press it 3 times, and then the next time, in order to get a pellet, you got to press it 10 times, and then the next time it's 7 times. So that it becomes very difficult for the rat to predict how many presses it's going to take. And so what you get is you get a high response rate. It's just going to stand there and press because it can't figure out the formula, right? And if there's enough variability in the ratio, in other words, if you have some high press requirements and some low press requirements, what you can get is you can get a situation where it'll stand there for a long time without any reinforcement, continuing to press the lever. And if you want a human example of this, slot machines. Slot machines are variable ratio reinforcement that is so effective that you have people who literally will wear diapers. I mean, like literally, people will wear diapers. People will develop rotator cuff problems because they're pulling the levers so much. In fact, Las Vegas figured that out. Like, okay, we're not going to make them pull levers anymore because if they get a sore shoulder, they won't keep pulling the levers. We'll make it a button. So now all they got to do is push the button. They keep feeding those quarters and pushing the button, and they figure out the variable ratio schedule to sustain that behavior as long as possible without a reward. So we give them little reward, little reward, little reward, with the promise at some ratio that you're going to get a big reward, enough to keep them coming back and coming back and coming back. Remarkably effective reinforcement schedule. And here you see just a general summary of what I was just talking about, the differences in terms of acquisition and extinction between continuous intermittent ratio and interval reinforcement schedules. Okay, just real quick, I wanted to give you a quick kind of summary review of the distinctions between classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So, basic way to kind of keep these straight in your head. Classical conditioning, you don't do anything, it's done to you, right? Operant conditioning, it involves the response of the environment, consequences, to your voluntary behavior, right? So you're either being reinforced or punished for something that you're choosing. Whereas in classical conditioning, you're not doing anything. It's being done to you in order to establish the conditioning. Classical conditioning involves placing a neutral signal before a reflex, whereas operant conditioning involves applying reinforcement or punishment after you do something, right? So it's consequences, it's after the behavior. Classical conditioning is pairing a reflex or an instinctual behavior with what ends up becoming the conditioned stimulus to either get you to do something or prevent you from doing something, right? So let me give you general table also to help you kind of keep these two things straight in terms of how you acquire the response, how extinction, how you extinguish the response, what we hypothesize is going on cognitively, and the relative involvement of the biology. I'm not going to go through all this because we've already talked about this in the prior slides. So I just wanted you to have kind of a general picture all on one slide. Okay, just a last couple of things before we stop. The first one I wanted to make sure I mentioned is back when learning theory was still relatively new, John Watson, one of the founders of learning theory, of behaviorism, and frankly Skinner too, they kind of overinvested in it, you might say. They got to the point where they saw all human behavior in terms of learning theory. And it led to some fairly creepy ideas. One of the creepy ideas is that they argued at sometimes that there was no such thing as consciousness, that consciousness was an illusion, and we talked last class period, I think it was, about how that's demonstrably not just not true, it's the opposite of true, right? The consciousness is the one thing that cannot be illusory. It's the one thing that has to be real. Everything else might be an illusion, but consciousness is not. And consciousness demonstrably exists because you're experiencing it right now. I'm experiencing it right now. Like it's a real thing. But they also, the early behaviorists, also went overboard in just how powerful the environment is in the process of learning. They underestimated biology, frankly. They underestimated genetic disposition. They underestimated free will, arguably. But the classic example is from Watson, from John Watson, who famously asserted, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed in my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one of them at random and train them to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, chief, and yes, even beggarman and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and the race of his ancestors." So one, that road that he is proposing is a bad road to go down, because it's essentially saying, you give me enough control over somebody and I can turn them into anything you want. And if you think that I'm being a little alarmist at making that point, go do some research about Nazi Germany, current communist China, the Soviet Union, and other particularly totalitarian communist regimes, because they did exactly this. They operated according to this principle, and frankly, they achieved some pretty remarkable results. Go back and look at the East German swimming team, which was the communist part of Germany prior to them being reunified after the Cold War. They were taking their female swimmers and injecting them with steroids and essentially training them during every waking hour, and they were remarkably effective. The communist China does this with the gymnasts. From the moment they're 3-4 years old and they have some evidence that they might be good at gymnastics, that's what they do. That's all that they do. So there is some truth to this. You can shape somebody tremendously within the boundaries of their potential, but the boundaries of their potential are well, we'll set aside free will. We'll set aside the ethics of all of this, but the boundaries of their potential are the issue. I mean, the reality is, my daughter's 5'6", 130 pounds maybe, and a reasonably good athlete. Well, I could give her all the best training in the world, the best nutrition, the best training, like weight training and that sort of thing. There is nothing in the world that I can do to make her a center in the NBA, a basketball player, right? A professional basketball player. A woman, well, there's no woman who has ever been able to play in the NBA just because of the size and speed differences in males and females. But certainly not, 5'6", 130-pound female. And you can say, oh, well, she's only 18 years old. We could train her until she's 35, and it's not going to happen, right? And I know that's an exaggerated example, but he's making a very expansive claim here, and there are very clear examples of why this is explicitly not possible, let alone whether it's desirable, right? So early learning theorists, behaviorists overestimated the importance of the environment and underestimated genetic disposition in biology. Some examples of the ways in which that they underestimated that genetic disposition, the way that they underestimated biology. I think I may have mentioned this before when we were talking about phobias. I don't remember. There's this idea of preparedness, which appears to be genetically encoded, or biology is arranged in such a way that we acquire certain phobias unbelievably easily. One trial observational learning, which we're going to talk about observational learning in just a moment before we stop. But if a parent is with a young child and they see a snake and the parent acts subtly afraid of the snake, the child will acquire a fear of snakes essentially instantaneously. It's as if our nervous systems are programmed to acquire a fear of snakes. We're somewhat disposed in that direction. So we have that idea of preparedness for essentially to avoid certain threats. Yeah, I'm not going to say much more on that. Don't worry about conditioned taste aversion. I'm gonna skip you on that because I'm already up on almost 2 hours, and I'm trying to keep as short as I can because I'm a kind soul. Last thing I want to talk about is the third basic kind of learning, right? So we got classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and what we call observational learning. And observational learning is exactly what it sounds like it is. It is the idea that you can learn something by watching it. And to some degree, you can learn something by watching without even the explicit intention to learn that thing. And the best example is the example there on the slide. By the time you were 15 years old and were preparing to sit for your driving exam, and you sat down for the first time behind the wheel of the car, you kind of had a basic framework for how to drive, right? You had never driven, well, some people have never driven before at that point, but they basically had an understanding that you steer the steering wheel and you do something with your feet and mess with the lever over here to make it go or go in reverse and that kind of thing. Like you had a general picture of how a car works because you had acquired that learning observationally. So I'm not going to say a whole lot more about this. The book speaks to it at some length. There's not a whole lot I have to add to it. Be aware that it isn't exclusively kind of by osmosis. You have to direct some degree of attention, even if it's not intense attention. It has to be something that you're capable of retaining. It has to be a behavior that you're able to reproduce. Observational learning. We can have you, using the basketball example again, we can have you try to learn how to dunk a basketball by observation, but the reality is, if you're 5'4", you can observe all you want. You're not going to do it. You don't have the capacity to reproduce the behavior, right? So attention, retention, reproduction, and then obviously motivation. Your observational learning improves the more the person wants to learn by observation. So the more effort that is being put into it, right? Like I said, not going to speak much more about that because I think the book covers it fairly well. I don't have a whole lot to add, and frankly, it's not as complex as the issues of classical and operant conditioning. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about the learning theory chapter. Good evening.